We are going to see about test classes. Importantly, we are going to cover about the Apex trigger side. So this is a vast topic. There are many things are there. Integration side also, mock test classes, all those things are there. So today we will specifically focus on Apex trigger side and also the process that we need to follow. We need to invest the time in test class. Why means we can find the bugs very early and we can add the new features with the confidence. We can reduce the manual testing time, and we sometimes it's difficult to test all the scenarios manually, so that time test class is helpful, and it is also helpful for the regression testing. It boosts the developer confidence. So if we have written the test class in proper way, then we can be confident that this feature will work fine. So this is why we need to invest the time in test class. So the next thing is steps to follow while writing the test class. So the first thing is we need to identify the test cases for covering in the test class. So usually what we will do, we will write the test class in the mentality of covering the code coverage of 75%. But that should not be the case. Our focus should be covering the important scenarios. So then only we need to start writing the test cases. So that is the first step when we start writing test class. Okay. So for that, when we were seeing the minimal trigger framework structure, we saw this requirement like we need to update the rollup of all the time logs to task total spent effort field, and also we need to prevent updating the time log if the task payment status is invoiced. So these two things saw in the minimal trigger framework session. We created the trigger handler, all those things using the minimal trigger framework structure using virtual and extending that virtual class. So now we are going to see how we can write the test class for that. So for that, first we need to focus on writing the test cases. So developer, instead directly going and writing the test class with the mindset of covering 75%, we need to first complete the writing test cases. Then we need to start with the test class. We need to keep all these things in the mind. So the first thing is don't focus only on happy path. So what we will usually do with the intention of covering 75%, we will just focus on the happy path, that success path, which will usually pass only because while doing the code only, you are well aware about the happy path and you must have written well. So anyway, it will get success. So don't focus only on the happy path. So whatever other things I have mentioned here, you guys need to check. So for the first thing is null or empty scenario checking. So you need to think whether your code will pass the null or empty scenario. So while doing the development itself, you need to have that kind of thinking. And also this needs to be there in the test case also. So the next thing is bulk testing. So definitely bulk testing needs to be done for all the trigger related automation triggers, all those things. So don't bulk testing means don't test till 200 only, because if you are testing till 200 anyway, it will go in single batch only inside the Apex trigger. I think you guys already know Apex trigger is getting executed for every 200 record in the single batch. So you need to check for more than 200 records. Then only you can get the issues related to the trigger regression, all those things. So this also, while doing the development itself, you need to keep in the mind, and also you need to have this in the test case. So the next thing is negative scenario. So some methods may have negative scenario and some may not have the negative scenario. Wherever negative scenario is applicable, you guys need to check. Maybe you have try catch block in your code. Then you need to make sure you are testing the catch block as well. So that you need to keep in the mind. So the same thing we are speaking here also. And next thing is, while writing the test case, we need to keep all the DML scenarios in the mind. So sometimes what you guys will do, like you will do only for insert or update. You will not do the test case for deletion, but it can create the issues later. So you need to make sure you are covering all the DML scenarios in the test cases, and you need to test for the different kind of users. So it's not always required. There are scenarios when you need to check for the different kind of users that I will explain in the next slide. So now let's see for this requirement how to write the test cases by keeping all these things in our mind. So I can share this Excel sheet. So what I have done is I just wrote the Apex test method name and the test case type and the object on which we are doing the DML and what DML it is doing, and do we need it to any pre-setup, and what will be the new setup of values, and we are running as system admin or other user, and what should be the expected result. So first we are doing for the null or empty check. So this is running on the time sheet. So when the time sheet is updated, it is updating the task. So we are doing for, we need to check for both create and update by populating spent effort is equal to null. So this is the null check. So maybe you didn't handle the null properly in your code. That time there is chance this test case can fail. So your test class needs to have this, and also same thing for delete and undelete also I added. Pre-setup means they are going to delete the record which is already filled as null, and they are going to delete the record which is already filled as undelete the record which is already filled as null. So when we don't need to consider this scenario or test cases, if there is already record field is marked for the spent effort in the time log, that time we don't need to test for these three. Anyway, it's not going to be valid. It's already mandatory in the field level. It should not be in the layout level. It should be mandatory in the field level. That time you may omit this check. So the next thing is bulk testing. So during the bulk testing, you can always ensure to check greater than 200 record. So here I put 300 record. And as I mentioned, I am covering all the DMLs, create, update, delete, and delete. All the DMLs I am covering. And this is the new set of values I am passing. So the next thing is happy path. So anyway, it will get success. It's simple create or update with the spent effort is 1. So either you can write all these test cases in the Excel sheet, then you can write it in the Visual Studio Code while writing the test class, or in the inside the test class only you can add like comment test case 1, test case 2, test case 3, and you can cover all these things. But you need to ensure you are covering null check, bulk testing, and the happy path. So the next thing is we have another one Apex test method. This is to show the error message when the task status is invoiced. So here negative scenario is coming. So negative scenario is when the task is invoiced, it needs to throw the error message. Okay, so that is covered. So next we are checking the happy path, and here also we are doing the bulk testing. So what happens if we are deleting the record in the bulk, whether our code is working or not, that also we need to check, right? So maybe you didn't consider to throw the error message by looping through the list. You consider only the single record. That time this scenario will fail. So you need to make sure to test all these corner test cases and have this inside your test class. If you are doing this test in the manually in the org, it's definitely going to take a lot of time. So like for bulk testing, you need to create the Excel sheet and upload the record in the system and do the testing. It's going to take a lot of time. And the null scenario, sometimes you may not able to test it because in the page layout level it is required, but in the backend it's not required. So there it can be difficult to test it. So make sure while writing the test class, you are covering all the corner scenarios and writing the test class. Okay, so now we are ready with the test cases to cover in our test class. So next thing is we can start writing it. Okay, so here as we saw already, we have the trigger and trigger handler minimal. I just added this minimal to represent this is minimal framework to just differentiate, and we have the rollup task rollup manager class. So you guys know when we are writing the test class for the Apex trigger related methods or class, we don't need to write the test class in the mindset of covering the trigger. We can just focus on the end methods. So for example, so here inside this method we are calling another class calculate task total spent effort. So this is the end method. So we can cover only for this. Anyway, it will come from trigger handler to this end method. So in this path everything will get covered. And this restrict time lock, this is the end method. It's not calling any other method from here. So scope is within this only. Okay, so now I am going to explain about the very important thing called test data factory. So maybe till this point, some people may use the test data factory, but in the different way. Some people may not use the test data factory. Let's see about what is the best framework that we can follow for the test data factory. Okay, so this is the test data factory classes. This is the generic one. I can send you this code. We also have the GitHub link. I can share that also. So this is the generic class. You can go through this. You will easily get the idea. I will also explain few scenarios from this generic class. So we have the test data factory, and the next class we have is test data factory defaults. So this test data factory default is the place where we are maintaining all the default values. So for example, here I have created a task defaults and maintaining all the default values for the task record. And the same, this is resource default, all the default value for the resource record. Like that, for each object, we can maintain the default values for each object record. So we don't need to manually fill the values and create the test class every time. We can just call this test data factory and we can get the default values, and if we need to override in some places we can easily override it. So let me open the test class that I created. So this is the test class that I created, times trigger minimal test. And so maybe you guys already thinking like for each Apex class method it's fine to have single test method. It's not like that. For every scenario or test case we need to have the separate test method. So this is the Apex class name. Here we are doing the null check. We are passing the spent effort is null and we are checking if it is working or not. So here, since spent effort is the mandatory field, we can't pass the null. So I am checking with the 0. So the main thing we need is we need to create the timesheet record. By creating the timesheet record, it will automatically fire the trigger, and from the trigger it can go to the trigger handler, and from there it will go to the task roll of manager. Okay. So we need to create the timesheet. So for that, what I am doing, I am just calling the test data factory class and create as object method, and inside that I am passing the timesheet. Here we don't need to pass any values, so it's okay to leave empty because we already have the default values defined. Okay. So I am passing the value is here we are testing for the null scenario, but in the default value there can be any other values also there. So here 1 is there. So I don't want to use the 1. I need to override this 1 to 0. That's why I am passing this. Also I am passing the task ID and the resource ID. So for that, first we need to create the task and the resource. So that is also created in the single line. So here I am creating the resource with the default values. You guys can notice here I am not passing any resource values. So I am just calling the test data factory create as object method with the resource object type. That's it. And also next I am calling the task. While calling the task create, I am just passing this resource ID because I don't want to use the default resource ID. I need to override that. So I am passing this. So in this less number of line, everything is done since we are using the test data factory. Otherwise, either we need to put everything in the test setup method, or if we are going with the normal test data factory approach, normal test data factory approach means we will not have this intermediate class and all. So that time it's difficult to override the values. But here we are able to easily override the values. We can set the default values, but still while calling those we can override it. So in this very less number of line it is done. So one more thing, when you guys are writing the test method, it needs to have 3 sections. One is a given section and a when section and then section. So given section, it will have all the variable assignments or record creation, all those things needs to happen in the given section. And in the when section we will be calling the methods, Apex class method. Since this is called through trigger, insert only, both given and when section is together. And then section means what we need to do after calling or executing something from the test method, what we need to check, that needs to be there in the then section. So going forward, all of your test classes needs to have these 3 sections. So we can easily identify, okay, till this point different thing is happening, and from here checking is happening. So in the then section, it needs to have the assert statements. So there should not be any test method without assert statement. There should be definitely assert statement statement. So here we are using the assert equal to, and we are checking 0, and we are querying the spent effort and checking if it is coming 0. And we need to keep the test method with super descriptive. Super descriptive means it needs to be understandable by just seeing the method name. Each method can start with the test keyword. After that, it needs to have the descriptive name. Maybe you can keep the method name. After that, you can mention the test case name that you are testing, short term. So here like a test and Apex method name. After that underscore, then test case name you can put it. So we can easily identify what you are testing here, which test case you are testing here. So we saw about writing the test cases, then writing the test method with the super descriptive method name, and we also saw that test method needs to have given, when, then section. So he given, we prepare all the variables, objects, everything. In the when, we make the actual call to the Apex method, and in the then we verify if all is fine. While testing the test cases, when to test as other user in the test class, because every time we can't test the test class as other user, right? By running as other user, it's difficult because we need to create the user profile, permission set, all those things. But anyway, that will also become simple after this tested after utilizing this tested data factory default approach. But still, we need to be sure when to test as other user. So the first thing is like we have some Apex class with the with sharing keyword, and that time that feature is used by the community user. Then you need to check the feature by using by running the test method as specific user. Okay, but if you are already sure they have all the permissions and everything, it's not required. But it's good whenever there is scenario that you go with the community user, it's always best to write the test method to run as community user for testing, because we face so many issues in that context. So there are some special access that we need to give when the testing when the features are working in the community. So same for DML also. So either with sharing, we are querying something, and DML with if you are performing the DML with the Apex normal system mode, it's fine. But if there is any specific scenario to work for the particular user or profile, that time you need to test the test method in the user mode. So the next thing is inside your code only, you may have some permission to check. There are some feature that needs to be executed only for certain user profile or permission set or custom permissions. So that time you need to run the test method as run as user. So for example, you need to restrict the deletion of the record only to the set of user, not for all the user. So that time anyway, you need to run the test method as a different user and see whether it is working for the user who is having the permission, and whether it is not working for the user who is not having the permission. So that type you need to check. So during the development also, it needs to be there in your mind always, for whom we are developing this feature. That should be on top of your mind. So most of the time what we do now, we only focus on the feature and implementing this. We forget who is going to use the feature and where they are going to use the feature, whether they are going to use the feature in the desktop or mobile. All those things we miss it, but it needs to be there on our top of mind always. So because sometimes we develop the feature, but client will come and tell the issue that it's not working from the community, but we would have never thought that they will use this feature in the community. Okay, so it's always important who is going to use the feature and what kind of permissions they have. So you need to be clear with that. When you are receiving the requirement, you need to be clear with who is going to use the feature. Inside Salesforce also, which profile is going to use the feature, you need to know whether it is sales profile, marketing profile, or admin profile. So you can write the code and give the permissions, write the test classes accordingly. So the next thing is best practices. So we need to have minimum 90% code coverage. So whatever the Salesforce test class we are writing, so we know 75% is the limit, but let's not stick to that. Let's maintain 90% code coverage. And of course, we know test class name needs to end with the test. And we need to have something for integration test also. Integration test means testing the feature in the higher level by combining all the unit tests. So we will see these things specifically in the coming sessions. For now, you guys can focus on the unit testing, and the test method name can start with the test, then Apex class name, then underscore, then test case name. And whenever you are calling the Apex from the test class, it's always good to call between the test.start test and the test.stop test, because sometimes we may have asynchronous process also. So when you are calling the some Apex class from the test class, you always keep this in mind. You can always include in test start and stop test also. It's all good thing. There is no side effects because of that. And you can perform the DML whenever is needed, because we don't need to perform DML all the times from the test class. Then every org needs to have the test data factory class. That's really important. What we saw now, it needs to have the test data factory and the test data factory defaults. So even we can set the defaults based on the different scenario. Like sometimes in the object, for the different stages, different mandatory field will be there. So for each stage, we can set the default values. So when we are calling this, we can pass the certain default values. So assert statement, you guys are already aware and using it, but you need to make sure each test method is having at least one assert statement. And you can always use the assert statement, which is having all these parameter expected actual message. So we can also use this or equal or not equal without a message, but you guys always maintain that message also. So it's a good. So these are the main 5 assert statement that we come across usually. So you definitely needs to have the assert statement inside the then function, that is mandatory. So in the Visual Studio only we can run the code, test code, we can see the code coverage, all those things. This is for creating the single record with the null values. So here it was 0 and we checked this. We can also run test and see if it is working fine, whether assert statement is passing or not, that we can check. Let me run the test. See, from here only you can run the test. As I told previously, make sure you guys use the Visual Studio Code only for doing all the things. So you need to get very familiarized with this. Okay, cool. So it passed. Pass rate is 100%. So it's fine. This test method is fine. So next for bulk testing, also it's very simple. So you guys don't need to do the loop over and create the record. So in the test data factory only we have the default method. So in the test data factory, we have the method called create as object list. So before we saw create as object. Create as object means it will create the single record with the default values mentioned in this class. Create object list means it will create the bulk records. Here also you can override the values. So here I am overriding the spent effort to 1 and this also I am overriding, but this code is very simple. I am not populating any values. I am just using the default values set in the test data factory default class. And here I am just passing 300 means how many records we need to create. So that we can pass it here to the create as object list class. I am passing 300. So what it will do, it will create the 300 timesheet records. See, this code also looks very simple. I am not using any loop statement here and I am not passing all the default values. So bulk testing is done with this simple code, and after that here we are verifying it whether we are getting 300. Here we query it and checking whether we are getting the 300. So let's run this test class and see if it is getting success. See, if there is no assert statement, maybe test method may pass, but values might not be same. So it's always good to use the assert statement. So it's also passed. So we are good here also. So now we saw about the 2 method from the test data factory. One is create as object, another one is create as object list. Create as object is used to create the single record. As object list is used to create the bulk records. You can just pass the count of how many records to create. That's it. There can be some scenario like customer may have, like you may have some LWC component or something. They may tell that we will upload 2000 3000 records. So that time also you can easily test it by passing 2000 here. So it's having n number of methods. So create S object list. Many methods we have it. You guys can have look on this, but this is the two main methods that you guys need to aware about. Create S object list, and in the default we will be setting the default values. So it's one time effort. So once you guys created the test data factory defaults with all the default values, you don't need to populate the values every time. You can just update that default values as required by using this override in easy way. That's it. So for now I have written only two test method, but we need to cover for all the things, all the corner case scenarios. So we need to cover in the test method. So we saw the debug test, run test, all those things. So